Pray with me as we turn to the book of Galatians, the 5th chapter. And we begin our reading this morning with the 22nd verse. We conclude this morning our series on the fruit of the Spirit. By contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against such things, and those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit. Let us not be conceited, competing against one another, envying one another. Chapter 6, my friends, if anyone is detected in a transgression, you who have received the Spirit should restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness. Take care that you yourselves are not tempted. Verse 9, so let us not grow weary in doing what is right, for we will reap at harvest time if we do not give up. I want to end our series this morning on the fruit of the Spirit, and I want to talk to you about gentleness and self-control. Gentleness and self-control. The early church, the church of Jesus Christ, was born and took its first steps in a hostile environment. The early church, the pre-Constantinian church, the church that existed before the empire got a hold of us and promoted us and confused us. That church was a martyr church. It was a persecuted church. Like the church of the slaves, the American slaves, it was an invisible institution. And it could not be other than a persecuted church because it was a freedom church. It was a liberationist church that was pushing against the grain of the oppressive politics and imperial cultural ethos of the Roman Empire. And so it was subjected to violence and hostility and persecution. If you've never had a head-on collision with the devil, all that means is that the two of you are riding in the same car. But if you stand for what is right and just and true, every now and then evil will make it to your doorsteps. And all that means is that you're doing something right, so you ought to rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. The early church was always in trouble, and that's because it was pushing against the grain. Caesar, like most politicians, thought he was Lord. Kurios. The early church did a strange thing. It declared that a poor Palestinian peasant crucified on Caesar's cross, Rome's electric chair, was Lord. Jesus and not Caesar is Lord. Can't you see that's not just a spiritual statement, that's a political statement. Imagine that. Jesus, who came preaching this crazy upside down gospel, this counterintuitive gospel, this gospel that takes the world's assumptions and turns them on their head. Jesus, who came preaching that the meek shall inherit the earth, and that the kingdom belongs to the poor and the persecuted, and that the peacemakers are the children of God. This Jesus, they said, is King of kings and Lord of lords. No wonder they were always in trouble. And he ascended into glory, but he sent us his Spirit. And his disciples captured that Spirit and covered in his name. They came preaching good news in bad times. They came talking about love in a world filled with hate, peace in a world marred by violence, justice when there was so much injustice all over the land. In other words, the church's job then and now is to preach and provide an alternative vision, a different way of seeing the world, a different way of being in the world, a different way of moving in the world. It's our job, church, to be different. It's our job to be a royal priesthood, a holy nation called out. And I thought about that as we arrived at the church on Thursday morning to discover Confederate rebel flags at our doorsteps. I said, we've been picked out to be picked on. Imagine that, rebel flags at the doorstep of the Ebenezer Baptist Church just a few short weeks after a young man inspired by that flag went into a Wednesday night Bible study and killed 9 precious souls. And the question is, how ought we to respond? What shall we say about these things? Well, we came to say what we have been saying all summer. We came to say that we are people of the Spirit, that we are people of Pentecost. And you remember what happened on the day of Pentecost. The Spirit of God came in the room. And when the Spirit of God came in the room, everybody had some power. Didn't matter where you came from, what part of town you were born in, everybody had some power when Pentecost came. And you know what else happened on Pentecost? The Spirit of God moved and everybody could understand everybody else because the Spirit of God was in the room. And I'm here to tell you that somehow the church has got to capture that Spirit and allow that Spirit to become contagious. The world needs your witness, and the world needs to feel the presence and the power of the Spirit of God, not inside the church walls, but outside of the church walls. And so Paul writes to the church at Galatia, he says, the fruit of the Spirit is love and joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness. I talked about all of those, but this morning I want to talk about generosity. I want to talk about gentleness and self-control. We are witnessing a coarsening in our public discourse. There are harsh words that we have for one another. There seems to be this thinking in America today that somehow you need to demolish those with whom you disagree. And if you castigate an entire ethnic group, an entire country, while running for president of the United States, it will cause your poll numbers not to go down but up. There's something sick about that. But there are a lot of angry folk in America. We heard them over the last several years saying we want our country back. And somehow that evil and that malice and that sense of feeling threatened made its way into the mind of a misguided young man, and he made his way into the Mother Emanuel AME Church. This is not something to play with. There is too much mean-spiritedness in too much of our public policy and our political rhetoric, and the church now more than ever needs to model gentleness and self-control. But can I tell you, we can't teach the world how to be gentle if we can't be gentle with one another. I know you didn't know it, but church folk aren't always gentle. In fact, some church folk are some of the meanest folk I know. And so Paul writes to the church at Galatia, and he says, now the fruit of the Spirit is gentleness. And it ought not be lost on you that as he's writing to the church at Galatia, they are engaged in a church fight. They are in an argument about who's in and who's out. And there's some folk who are saying that in order to be in, you have to be circumcised. In other words, in order to be clear that you have the Spirit, you have to look like us and dress like us and move like us. You know how religious folk are. We can be narrow and self-righteous. You have to do it the way we do it. They are in an argument about who's in and who's out. And Paul is saying, do not let anybody make a slave out of you. Christ has already set you free, and so the fruit of the Spirit is gentleness. But Paul, even as he's making this argument, he himself has some growing to do. Because remember, as he's arguing against those who are arguing for circumcision, he says, basically, I'm sick and tired of these folk who are arguing that you need to be circumcised. In verse 12, he says, I wish those who are arguing for circumcision would go and castrate themselves. It's in the Bible. And then he says, the fruit of the Spirit is gentleness. So let's be honest. Sometimes it's hard to be gentle when you're caught up in the fight. But we have to be reminded of who we are and whose we are. And can I be honest, it was difficult on Thursday to keep my cool, because we know what that flag represents. It flew over an army whose cause was captivity. Thank God it is the defeated flag of a defeated army. If it had prevailed, I would be a slave. And to defend it as simply heritage adds insult to injury. Its heritage is hatred. And to deliver it to the front door of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, the home church of Martin Luther King Jr., is a hateful act and a terroristic threat. And we have to say that. Let's be clear. To lay a Confederate flag at the doorsteps of this church is the same as drawing a swastika on the door of a Jewish temple. It is a hateful act and a terroristic threat. And I know some of y'all came to church this morning for a cool and soothing experience. But this is real talk this morning. I've got to talk about terrorism because there is confusion in the land. Folk act like terrorism was just invented. Black folk have been dealing with terrorism for a long time. A long time. Before Al-Qaeda, there was the KKK. Long before ISIS sought to send a devastating message through decapitations gone viral, people used to gather sometimes after church with their children on their shoulders, watching as they hang black men and black women from southern trees. Terrorism wasn't just invented. We've been dealing with terrorism for a long time. Terrorism is not a race. Terrorism is not a religion. It is a vicious and menacing political statement intended to arouse fear and vulnerability. And I've got to say this because when we racialize terrorism, act like only certain people can be terrorists. And when we dress it up in a stereotype, act like you have to look a certain way or pray to a certain God, we give cover to bigots and extremists, and we reinforce the very idea we seek to condemn. And so, law enforcement is still trying to figure out how to classify this thing. I thought I would help them. Because as I look at this thing, as I look at what happened in Charleston, and the FBI director quickly saying, I don't see how this can be a terroristic act. I don't see how it could not. Apparently black folk can't be terrorized. Do you understand what you're saying to us? This is our sanctuary. This is our rock in the weary land. This is our shelter in the time of storm. This is where we raise our babies and marry our spouses and bless our children. This is our church. This is the house of the living God. And when you defile it, you're sending a clear message. And if your black body and your psyche and the psyche of your children cannot be safe in a predominantly black church, where can you be safe? But I came to tell you, church, don't become cold and mean-spirited and cynical. The world needs our witness right now. The fruit of the Spirit is gentleness. Mean-spiritedness is what has gotten us in this mess that we're already in. Ironically, as we received word the other day about the flags, do you know what we were doing? We were gathering here with pastors from all across the nation to talk about America's prison industrial complex and the need for criminal justice reform. Did you know that we warehouse more people in prison than the next 25 European nations combined? We've got more folk in prison in America than they do in China and North Korea and all of the other regimes that we like to critique. We've got more people in prison than we had in chains in 1850. We've got a greater percentage of the black population in prison than we had in slavery in 1850. We got a greater percentage of our folk in jail than did South Africa at the height of apartheid. Nobody even comes close to us when it comes to locking up black and brown bodies. And we're here because over the last 35 years, politicians told us that we need to get tough on crime. We believe them, and now our prisons are crowded to capacity and overflowing with people who need mental health care and people who have committed non-violent drug-related crimes. And it's choking the life out of our nation. We can do better than this. And for some of you self-righteous Christians who say, yeah, they ought to lock all of them up and throw away the key, you ought to read your Bible. Start with the text we read this morning. If your brother is detected in a transgression, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness. We need restorative justice. And so we were gathered on Thursday to talk about that. But check this out. I've been dealing with media long enough to know that no major media outlet would have covered our conference. But a confused and misguided person with some $2 flags and 2 cents worth of brain put us on the national stage. So we could tell America to reform the justice system, protect voting rights, and give our children, all of our children, a chance. I'm trying to tell you, my beloved, that you don't have to beat your enemies down. If you would just be still, God will use them to lift you up and amplify your message and glorify his name. If you would just be still and let God be God and all of his enemies scattered. Fruit of the Spirit is gentleness. And then all things God is working for the good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. That's how Paul put it. My grandmama put it this way. She said, honey, what the devil meant for evil, God meant for good. And so a journalist asked me the other day, what do you hope, Pastor, will happen to the perpetrators? I said, and I say it again this morning, I hope they catch them because I'd like to talk to them. After all, they came to the right place. They just came with the wrong message. Maybe we can help them. What I'm trying to say to you in your own life is you need to recognize in your own situation, some of you are pulling your hair out. You've got to come to realize you can't control somebody else. You can only control yourself. The fruit of the Spirit is self-control. The fruit of the Spirit is not enemy control. The fruit of the Spirit is not wife control. The fruit of the Spirit is not husband control or children control. The fruit of the Spirit is self-control. And self-control emerges from the recognition that God is in control. We lose control when we try to control that which belongs to God. That's when we lose our temper and lose our minds and make a rash decision and give in to temptation and lose everything we have because we're trying to control what God alone controls. But if you would ever give your life over to the one who is your life and who is your strength, and who is a friend who sticks closer than a brother, is there a witness today that God can do more with your life than you could ever imagine? And so we lose control when we feel threatened, forgetting that God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. We lose control when we feel cornered and we start to strike out on our own because we forgot that he will give his angels charge over thee to keep thee in all of thy ways. And we lose control when we feel attacked and we decide that we need to strike back because we forgot that no weapon formed against us shall prosper. And we lose control when we convince ourselves that we are by ourselves and in it all alone, forgetting that he promised, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And we lose control when we are at our wits' end and we're saying, I don't know what to do. That's when you need to recognize that that's a good place for you to be in. Because when you hear yourself say, I do not know, that's when God says, I know you don't know, I know. In fact, I know the plans that I have for you. Is there a witness? Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. I am God, and I'm going to work it out. There was this little boy, as I close, who kept disrupting class. He was 5 years old, kept carrying on in class. He was a smart young man, a strong-willed child. And so the teacher said, you know what, I got to do something because he's disrupting class, and he needed to give him something to keep him busy. And so he gave him a puzzle, an old jigsaw puzzle. Everything is virtual now. I don't know if our kids know what that is, a jigsaw puzzle. And it was a puzzle of the entire globe. He took the whole world and put it in his hands and said, I tell you what, put this together. And then no time flat, that little rascal had put it together. Teacher began to scratch his head and say, how in the world did you do that? That should have taken much longer. That should have tied you up the rest of the day, and you've done it in a short period of time. He said, well, on one side, teacher, there was a picture of the globe. But on the other side, there was the picture of a man's face. And I didn't worry about putting the world together. I just decided to put the man together. And when I put the man together, I discovered that I had put the world together. I'm trying to tell you that while you're worried about what God is doing in the world, every now and then you ought to just work on yourself. You ought to put the woman together. You ought to let God put the man together. You can't control your enemies. You can't control the world. But if you would allow God to work in you, maybe God can use you to work on the world. So let us not grow weary in doing what is right, for we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. We've got to keep on fighting together and praying together and struggling together and being patient one with the other. And we shall overcome.